Yes, welcome again to our CAWASA Water Wednesday webinars. And pretty dry today, but we've had a few days of solid rain. As I just told Candice, it was like a monsoon in the past few days. But it's all good. I think we all need to replenish our water reserves. And this evening, we're going to be speaking on groundwater, and that's another one of our sources. And to do that for us, we are very privileged to have with us the Secretary to the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association, who is also a water resources management specialist. And she is raised in Tabakit, in a rural village in Trinidad on the edge of the Navet Dam and the water treatment plant. She has spent 15 years working in the water. I think it's 16 years now.
Yeah, it's 16 years now.
Yeah, 16 years working in the water sector on a team with responsibility for Trinidad and Tobago's water resources. She completed studies in water resources management and sustainable development while engaged in work and research in climate change, agriculture, youth, and rural development. Currently, she's reading for a MSc in project management and hopes to pursue a doctoral research in water sector planning and management for small island developing states. In 2016, she was elected to serve on the executive of the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association. And I can tell you she's a very dynamic, energetic, and enthusiastic youth in the water sector. And we had her with us at CAWASA's our Water Operators Conference in St. Lucia. I was at 2019, it looked so far away.
Yeah.
We had such a wonderful time. And she's been doing great work for the CWWA, and we are pleased to have with us Candice Santana, the CWWA Secretary and Water Resources Specialist in Trinidad and Tobago, to present on introduction to groundwater this evening. So over to you, Candice. I will now allow you to share your screen. I'm going to stop sharing mine. Just a second. I've gone with the technology there. All right. So it's all yours now. And for some of our participants who are joining us, we again welcome you, and we wish to reassure you that the proceedings are being recorded and you will have a copy before the night is over. And you can always review it and share it with your colleagues who missed the webinar today. Over to you, Candice.
So, Ignatius, I'm just ensuring that you're seeing my screen.
Yes, we are.
Great. So this is an introduction to groundwater for Caribbean water operators. I am Candice Santana, as Ignatius said. I like to talk about where I'm from. I'm from Tabakit, which is on the edge of the Navet Dam and the Navet water treatment plant. I think I saw at least two persons from my small village on. I would like to say a special good afternoon to Mr. Gill and Mr. Mylon. Right, let's get into it now. So there's an old saying that you never miss the water till the well runs dry. It's a time-old saying. And there's some level of truth to this saying. So we're here this afternoon to find out where this water is coming from that's in this well. And we also want to protect it from running dry. Groundwater essentially accounts for about 70 to 90% of the water supply from some Caribbean islands. In other Caribbean islands, the story might be a bit different depending on the circumstances. Why groundwater? In some of our islands, we are impacted by extreme dry conditions. Extreme dry seasons, long dry seasons, and even drought conditions. Groundwater is less vulnerable to the impacts of these dry conditions compared to surface water. It is also much cheaper to treat than seawater. Many of our islands depend on desalination, and we know how expensive it is to treat desalination. If groundwater is present, it is typically cheaper to treat with groundwater than to treat with seawater, because it's generally cleaner. It's beneath the earth. It would have already been filtered by some of the natural gravel systems, and so on. So what we're going to learn about today, we're going to learn a little bit about groundwater, the types of aquifers, types of wells, and some data collection from wells. Groundwater exists typically in a saturated zone beneath the land surface. I want to bring this up bigger, right? So typically we would have vegetation on our land surface that we see with our naked eyes. Beneath that we would have topsoil and we would have an unsaturated zone. Immediately after the unsaturated zone and to the top of the saturated zone, we have what we call the water table. Now, in some of our islands, historically, long ago, people used to dig what we would call dug wells, and they would essentially breach the water table and get water there. So the water table has been something that we would have all been familiar with over time. What is essential for us to note about this, though, is that in the unsaturated zone, we would have some level of water making its way to the saturated zone. The saturated zone might comprise of materials such as sand, gravel, or bedrock material. If it's a crevice rock type material or bedrock material, it will find its way through the crevices, and with the gravel systems, it will definitely find its way through every nook and cranny within your gravel system. The approximate level of your water table is essential and is an important factor for you to know when it comes to well drilling and so on. We would see that further down in this presentation. We should also note that there's a oneness of water. So your surface water and groundwater normally would have some kind of connection, and we could see that from this diagram. The surface water level is in line with the water table level at certain parts of your topography. And the surface water might essentially be your rivers, your lakes, streams. So, as I said earlier, in some countries, 90 to sometimes 70% of your water supply comes from groundwater. In Barbados, it's 90%. In Jamaica, it's about 84%. In Trinidad, it's about 24 to 25%. St. Kitts is about 70%. Some islands don't use groundwater for water supply per se, but there would be groundwater present. Grenada, Dominica, and St. Lucia. Given the reliance on groundwater in some of our islands, we need to study it in detail, we need to monitor in detail, and we need to definitely do sessions like these. So let's go into the whole realm of an aquifer. Many of us know in surface water that in surface water, our major storage of water would be our reservoirs or lakes, or surface water body, whether what name we call it by. In groundwater, though, we have aquifer systems. Your aquifers is somewhat similar to a watershed, but there are major differences. So your aquifer is a formation or a group of formation or part of a formation that contains significant saturated permeable material to yield significant quantities of water. If you can't yield significant quantities of water, essentially it's not an aquifer. So it might just be a saturated zone and not an aquifer. We have two major types of aquifers: confined aquifers and unconfined aquifer. A confined aquifer, and I would start from the bottom here of the diagram. Or let me go to the next page. Yeah, let me make it bigger. So let me start from the bottom. You have a confining bed that might be a solid rock system. Coming up from that now, you may have a confined aquifer system. This confined aquifer system would have another confining bed above it. Let's say something like clay might be confining it. When you come up from that now, you have an unconfined aquifer system. This unconfined aquifer system doesn't have any confining bed on it, and it's open to free flow recharge from the unsaturated zone. So let me start now from the left of your screen. You have the recharge area there, your first recharge area. And this recharge area, as we see, is recharging the confined aquifer system. The entire confined aquifer system is not recharged from a total overlaying area. It's just recharged from this small area. So we see the notation of where the water table is there with the triangle. And you see that line that goes straight across shows us the water table. The next item on the diagram is a flowing artesian well. This well is flowing artesian because it taps into the confined aquifer system. But if we look at the water table line, it's below the water table line. So there's a natural flow of water that comes out of this flowing artesian well. In some countries, a zone like this, we may have something called springs, especially if it's a faulted area. The water table well is the next thing on the diagram that I think we should discuss. The water table well essentially is a well that taps into your unconfined aquifer system, and the water level that we get from it is typically at the level of your water table. The next item on this diagram, of course, is another artesian well, and we can all imagine why this well is artesian. It's tapping into a confined system, and it's in line with your water table. So let's go to this slide. So we saw some wells in the slide before, and we should go into what these wells can do for us and what we need to know about them. So the first type of well we should be discussing is a monitoring well. A monitoring well does exactly that. It observes the aquifer and what is happening in your aquifer system. It's typically just a well that is drilled into your aquifer, and there's a gravel pack system to the bottom of it that allows for water to come side to side of your well and be able to come up into your well, and for you to be able to take water levels and take other readings. Your pumping well, and this is a well that most of us would be aware of, which is your production well essentially, or your pumping well. This is a well that would tap several layers of your aquifer or one layer of your aquifer system, and it would allow you to pump a particular amount. The amount that it pumps is something that would be normally determined when you're going to drill this well. Injection wells. Now, injection wells is something that we don't typically have here in the Caribbean. I'm not aware of any in Trinidad. I think that there was talk of some to happen in Barbados. I don't know if anybody from Barbados is on this webinar. But in Trinidad, we did look at doing injection wells. Injection wells essentially is wells that you would use for something called artificial recharge. Artificial recharge is recharging your aquifer without rainfall. Is essentially recharging your aquifer with surface water supply. For example, if you have an excess of surface water, but it's not direct rainfall recharge to your aquifer system. Now, let me go back a step here. Right, above the entire unconfined aquifer system, we have a recharge area there. But the unconfined system, recharge only happens in that area to the extreme left of your screen. What does that mean though, is that sometimes in confined aquifer systems, you may want to do some level of artificial recharge if you determine that it's economically feasible for you to do, and if it's something that your country is interested in doing. It's done around the world, and in some areas it's definitely worthwhile. Right. So this photo of me that is slightly filtered or very filtered is one with me taking water level readings in my younger WASA days. Why is it important to collect data from groundwater wells? Could we get interactive at this stage?
Feel free, it's your show.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody care to answer why is it important to collect data from groundwater wells?
Jason from Water Resources in Lucia.
Hi, Jason.
Hi, how you doing? To calculate your recharge rate as well as to determine the current water levels in the aquifer.
Yeah, so that's so true. So, right. So as Jason said, you want to be able to understand your aquifer and understand the dynamics of the groundwater movement. How quickly your water is moving, how old, how young your water is. And that's something that you would want to determine, especially with your deeper water, the water that's coming out of your confined system or from your deep bedrock systems. To evaluate your aquifer performance. How is your aquifer performing under stress? It's an extreme dry season. Are your water levels dropping quickly? How much water do you actually have in your aquifer system? To evaluate your well performance, is this an old well, a young well, a relatively new well? Is this a well that is a high performing well that I can depend on when it's an extreme condition and extreme time? A hurricane just hit my island. I need to get water supply back up quickly. I can't get my reservoirs up. Is this a good well, a well-performing well that I could rely on for water supply for a particular area? Those are questions that we could answer when we look at the data that we collect from our various groundwater wells.
Candice, we have I think Natasha Thorne has raised her hand. I think she wants to intervention.
Hi. I would, can you hear me?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes. I would like to know for the data collection, what types of determinations you all do on the groundwater?
All right, so I will get to that in a few slides. Yeah, I'm getting to that in a couple of slides.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. To recommend potential for further abstractions and more wells. So your population is growing, your demand for water is growing. You essentially might need more water, you need more wells. So this is to determine more wells. And of course, to protect your aquifer from over abstraction. You may be over abstracting to fulfill the demands placed on your water utility. So this is your production well. A look at it, a look at your pumping well. So essentially your discharge is happening at ground surface level. Immediately beneath that, especially when you just drill your well, you'll determine something called your static water level. Your static water level is your water level before pumping or once the well has been off for some time. In a gravel or sand system, you would want your well to be off at least 24 hours. In a bedrock system, you would want it to be off for a longer period. That doesn't mean you can't use a shorter period. So for example, in Trinidad here, what we may do is if we know we're going to have electricity disruptions, and the electricity disruption might last a 12-hour period, we might use that as an opportunity to take the static water level of our pumping wells. Once you take your static water levels, now you could start to determine something called your cone of depression. And your cone of depression is essential. It's like a cone, and it's essential to know what your cone of depression is, because this could tell you things about your aquifer as well as things about well performance. The calculation of your aquifer loss. Your aquifer loss is from your static water level to the bottom of your cone of depression. And your well loss is from that point to your pumping water level. So while your well is pumping, you can't take water levels. Typically, you put a PVC pipe in to the side of your well, and you will put your sounder in that and get your pumping water levels while the well is pumping. When you put on your well after a electricity disruption, for example, where you would have been able to get your static water level, you could take pumping levels at, let's say, 1 hour, 2 hour in intervals for a period of time and do calculations in terms of your step drawdown, your constant rate test, and things like your recovery test you could do on the reverse when you know that you took the well off because of this electrical disruption. Your cone of depression. Your cone of depression is something that is essential for you to know, because if you have several wells like we have here in Trinidad in an aquifer system or tapping out of a well field, you may have cones of depressions that connect, as well as you would have your observation wells located both in your cone of depression and out of your cone of depression. So those are things that you would need to be mindful of in terms of tracking what is happening in your groundwater system. So to answer one of Natasha's question, or part of Natasha's question, one of the many types of data that we collect from pumping wells, of course, is our abstraction data. This here is a plot from January 2001 to, I believe it's March or April, January 2000 is a recent update to this. This is the total production out of this particular aquifer system, out of this sub-aquifer system, sorry. So in Trinidad here, we would have determined sub-aquifers out of our aquifer system. And this is a total plot. What does that mean? This is a plot showing all the production that is happening in that sub-aquifer system, whether it's from a utility well or a private well. Yes, we have something called private wells here in Trinidad, where we have private companies that may come to us for a license to drill a production well for their use, but that's another discussion. So we're able to track our production, and we would see between January 2001 and January 2004, our water level would have been relatively steady and below 500,000. From January 2004 to around May 2008, we see that it's relatively steady during that period, but it's over 500,000. And then we would have had a decline in water levels from about May 2008 to January, February 2010. Another increase in production until January 2013, a decline in production between January 2013 and January 2018, and then water levels remain relatively steady around, let's say, 550,000 cubic meters per month for the remaining period. This is something important for us to track, because we can use this data versus our water level data, which you'll see later down in this presentation, to determine how production is affecting our water levels. Something that we've calculated here for most of our system is something called safe yield. Safe yield essentially is a safe amount that you can withdraw from your system without impacting your system, without depleting your system, without having any adverse impacts on your system. Now, the safe yield for this system sits at just over 400,000. What does that mean? It means that since 2001 to present, based on this safe yield calculation, we overpumping. But you'll see later down, you could look at your water levels and give or take where your production is concerned. For this system, this is one of the systems that came to me recently, and I looked at both the production and water level data from it, and I determined that we need to revisit our safe yield for the system. We'll talk about that a little bit in the rest of the presentation. I want to stay in our production wells and talk about specific capacity. And Natasha asked a real good question in terms of data that we could get out of our wells when we take different readings from them. Specific capacity. Specific capacity defines the relationship between the drawdown in the well and the discharge rate. The discharge rate essentially is your production rate or your abstraction rate. It's often used as a measure of well performance. It will vary with both time and flow rate. Lower specific capacities will result in deeper pumping water levels, resulting in higher energy costs to pump. And of course, most of us in our utilities, we want to ensure that our energy cost is low, especially to pump, because that essentially also impacts the cost of production. So I have an example of the calculation here, but I want to go to the diagram itself on your left. So earlier on in the presentation, we spoke about where the groundwater level is, where the ground surface level is, sorry, where your static water level would be, your aquifer loss, your well loss, and your drawdown. So your discharge rate, which is the rate at which you're pumping at, that over your drawdown, which is the area between the distance between your static water level and your pumping water level, will determine your specific capacity. Well efficiency. So well efficiency is something that is important to us here in the Caribbean and in our utilities that might be struggling with our finances. We want to make sure that we're getting a bang for our buck. We want to make sure that it's economically feasible and it's economic to pump from a particular well. So the efficiency, I want to give you two quotes here. The efficiency of pumping well express the ratio of aquifer loss, theoretical drawdown, to total measured drawdown in the well. A well efficiency of 70% or more is usually considered acceptable, with 65% being accepted as the minimum that you should go to. Essentially, your well efficiency, as I said before, is expressed as a percentage. So you're looking at your aquifer loss, which is your distance between your static water level and the end of the cone of depression versus or over your drawdown, which again is your static water level over your pumping water level, the distance between that. That expressed as a ratio would give you a well efficiency. I like to see well efficiencies that are around 90%, 80%. When it starts to go down to 75%, I start to get worried. And once it hits 70% or below that, I would have to relook what we're doing with this well. That is when essentially we would want to do some well maintenance here in Trinidad. Well maintenance might mean rehabilitating the well. It might mean taking out the screens and cleaning them. It might mean looking at the well and determining that this well is totally inefficient. It's not efficient. It's not yielding what it's supposed to yield, and converting it. Well, when we finished with a production well here in Trinidad, we converted to an observation well. So once it drops below that, we make some determination on what we want to do with this well. Of course, we need water. We need to put water on our system. So we would look at it from different lenses. Data collection from observation wells. So this is the observation well that matched the production that I showed you earlier on from the Tucker Valley gravels. And this I actually have data from 1998 to 2000 from this well. And what we could see from this well, from this observation plot, there are several wells that we plot here. And the reason for that is because all these observation wells tap into this subaquifer in our northwestern area. I want you to observe one of the first things that you could see from this plot. There are three, although we have so many wells, all the wells follow the same pattern, but there are three distinctive layers to the plots. You all see that? Okay. You all could feel free to answer me or tell me.
Yeah.
Right, good. So the ones to the top with the higher reduced water levels, those are actually the ones to the top of this aquifer. The ones in the second layer are the ones that are in the middle of this aquifer, and the ones to the bottom with the lower reduced water levels, those are actually the ones that are most coastal. Those are the ones that are to the end of the aquifer, and this aquifer is a coastal aquifer. During the period 2013 to 2018, that lower level went below 0 meters. So you would see -2, -4, -6. What does that mean here? So first and foremost, this is reduced water levels. It's actual water levels reduced to mean sea level. It means that during that period, these wells had water levels below mean sea level. Anybody care to give an insight on what they think that might mean?
Jason here again, that would open it up vulnerable to saline intrusion?
Yes, it would. One of the things that we would have looked at where I worked is to determine the saltwater freshwater interface here. But that's a whole nother discussion. So this essentially is just the data that operators and technicians collect from these wells. Is basically just putting your sounder down into your well and taking a reading at a designated point on your well. So water level measurements from observation wells are the principal source of information about the hydraulic stresses acting on aquifers and how these stresses affect groundwater recharge, storage, and discharge. So that's important for us to note and so on. So I want to go back a couple slides to just show you guys something. So remember that 2013 period to that 2018 period, right? Right. So 2013 production to 2018 production, we had a fall in production. So you would have expected that we would have had a fall in, we had a fall in production. So you would have expected that it would not have resulted in a fall in water levels, right? Let me repeat that again. We had a fall in water levels during that period. So you would have imagined that your production might have increased during that period and not fall, right? Hello?
You're talking about abstraction from the well?
Yeah. So from this system, during that period, 2013 to 2018, you had a fall in your water levels, your reduced water levels, right? So essentially, you would have imagined that production at that time would have either been increasing or steady. You would never have imagined that your production would be decreasing during that same period, right?
I think, Candice, I think there was someone who had their hand up. I think it was the person who had asked the question earlier.
Okay, they could ask the question. They could ask a question if they want.
Somebody had their hand up. Okay, you may not, so you can go ahead.
I am not seeing that witness just on my end. Hello?
Sorry, it was Natasha Thorne, I think.
Oh, Natasha, feel free to ask me a question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I guess I didn't remove
lower
it.
your hand. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. So back to what I was saying here. So during that 2013 to 2018 period, right, we saw on the water level plot that we had a decline in water levels, right? Typically, if you have a decline in water levels, you'll imagine that you will have an increase in production. However, we can see here that we didn't have an increase in production. We in fact had a decline in production. I'm seeing somebody named Mark.
Yeah, why would they not pump more during the decreased water level period?
All right, let me go back to the water levels, right? Just now. So when your water level is declining here, that's a bad sign. That's not a very good sign for your aquifer system. It means that your aquifer might be under stress. It means, and in this case, because it went below 0 to -2 or -4, and because this was a coastal aquifer, it meant that we could, in fact, have saltwater intrusion happening here. Right? So essentially, when this happens, you would imagine that you would have had an increase in production or very high production compared to other periods. Right? Because if you come back to this plot during 2013 to 2018, production was essentially declining. So you would expect that your water levels will not be also declining. You would expect that your water levels will show some kind of increase, or it might be getting steady, or it might be tapering off during that period, but that didn't happen here. Water levels continue to fall, even though production was also falling. So when somebody like me see that, I would want to do some further investigation. When we investigated further here, what we realized is that this area, okay, I'm not sure if somebody's hand is up. Hello? Mark?
No. Go ahead. No,
sorry, Candice. I'm looking for the hand on my screen, but I just can't see it to raise it. But just a quick comment.
Yeah.
Was there some kind of prolonged dry spell or drought condition happening
Yes.
during that time there?
So yes, that's essentially what it was. During 2013 and then again during 2015, 2016 in Trinidad here, we would have experienced long, prolonged dry seasons. And our wet seasons would have been drier than usual wet season. So recharge would normally happen in the wet season, but if your wet season is drier than usual, it means that even less recharge is happening. And then your dry season is a prolonged dry season. So minimal recharge would have been happening. So that's essentially the explanation for why that occurred in this subaquifer system. I want to pause here for a minute and ask if there are any questions.
One question from me. Your observation wells, are they the same as your production wells?
Some of our, so to be honest, right? Some of our observation wells are old production wells. Once a production well goes out, we may not just discard it, we may continue to use it to track the observation, to track the aquifer. Some of our observation wells are drilled as observation wells with adequate distance away from a production well to be away from your cone of depression to actually track the response of the aquifer to pumping.
You have another question, Candice, from Luther Tyson. What is the recharge rate?
Okay, so recharge rate is something I didn't put into this presentation, but essentially your recharge rate would be your rainfall, which is an input factor, minus your output factors. So whatever output factors you may have in that system, your surface water, runoff, your evaporation, your evapotranspiration. Whatever is left is infiltration. And your infiltration rate by the size of your recharge area will give you your recharge rate. In some instances, what we do is we use 80% of your recharge rate as your safe yield. That's one method of calculating your safe yield.
There's another question here from Derek Jones. What early indicators will tell us when to stop extracting from a production well?
Drop in the efficiency of the well, declining water levels, and one of the things I didn't mention in this presentation, though, that we need to also look at is the quality of your water. Sometimes when your water levels start to drop, your quality of water also changes. So in a coastal aquifer, you may find high chloride levels, high conductivity levels when your water level is dropping, and that essentially might be an indicator that you need to reduce your pumping or stop pumping altogether. We have had instances around the Caribbean where we would have had saltwater intrusion into aquifers, here in Trinidad too, and we would have reduced pumping or stop pumping altogether and allow the system to rejuvenate itself, recharge, and then restart pumping either months later or years later. Any further questions?
Yeah, let me ask a question, Candice. You hear me, by the way?
Yes, Derek, I
Okay,
am.
great. In terms of contaminants, right? With regards to the aquifer, what type of contaminants are, well, I guess most common in, well, let's just look at Trinidad then. In Trinidad, I guess it would be replicated throughout the Caribbean in some way, but what are the main contaminants we look at, or we look for?
Okay, so I think I should go on with the rest of my presentation to help answer that question, right?
Okay, great.
So spotlight on Trinidad, and you ask about Trinidad specifically. This is actually a hydrogeological map created by the Water Resources Agency in Trinidad. the map would indicate, this map indicates all the aquifer systems and where production wells, observation wells are located, and some other things that are related to groundwater are located. So what will impact your groundwater? Derek asked. So the first thing that will impact groundwater around the Caribbean is saltwater intrusion. Most of us live on tiny rocks where the groundwater or the aquifer might be open to the sea. And once you start abstracting from these systems, the pull factor, your pull in water, will occur and could essentially bring salt water into your aquifer system. So you would end up with high chloride levels, high conductivity levels. Most of our islands, or many of our islands, our population and residential areas are concentrated in a particular part of the island. In Trinidad here, it's concentrated on the east-west corridor and along that area from the northwest down to the southwest. Once you have residents, you have commercial activities happening, and you have pollutants going out, free flow into the environment, there can potentially be an impact on your aquifer system. As well as if you have agricultural areas and you have the use of fertilizers, you can have some impact on your aquifer system. So let's say in agricultural areas, or area where you have a high amount of agriculture concentrated, you may find a high amount of nitrates and phosphates in your groundwater. In some residential areas, you may find contaminants from the car dealers and so on, but some of these things get trapped in the layers above your groundwater. So it may get trapped in your gravel system and so on. And the other thing too to note, Derek, is that if it goes into your aquifer system and it dilutes, it may not have a major impact on human health. Because, you know, these things would need to be within your World Health Organization levels. What else can I say here? Oh yeah, so Navet Dam is located to the center of Trinidad. So let me go on to put the spotlight on Jamaica. Now, Jamaica, as I said before, Jamaica depends on groundwater much more than most of the Caribbean. I think it's up to about 90% of their water supply, public water supply, comes from groundwater. Most of their aquifer systems are either limestone or alluvial systems. What you have, however, happening in Jamaica, and this goes back to what I was just saying about seawater pollution, a lot of their coastal aquifers are now contaminated by seawater. They have high chloride levels. Some of their systems they did shut off and shut down, and some they reduce the pumping to allow the freshwater, saltwater interface to move back out towards the sea than inland. One of the things I want to bring up at this point in the presentation is the impact of sea level rise because of climate change. It's something that we talk about, but we don't talk about it in depth. It's something that I've never seen a really in-depth study for the Caribbean on. And the truth is, with sea level rise and the push of your saltwater, freshwater interface, you could essentially be impacting a coastal aquifer system without pumping or without the pressure of pumping. Just food for thought. It's something that might not or may not happen today, but it's something that we might need to factor into how we manage our systems and how we manage with climate change. Let me put the spotlight on Barbados now. Barbados would have done their physical development plan in 2017. But prior to that, they would have had a lot of groundwater development there. And one of the things I want you to notice, Barbados is one of the few countries in the Caribbean that would have what is known as groundwater protection zones. It's all highlighted here, Zone A, Zone B, and Zone C. We see it on the map here. Why is this so? A major part of Barbados's water supply comes from groundwater. And these systems are limestone systems. Most of us enjoy going to Barbados and going to the caves. And those caves are essentially limestone. And therein their water supply comes from those limestone systems. If they don't protect these areas can easily become contaminated. Derek asked an important question. Groundwater pollution is one of the biggest challenges that groundwater will face. And water on an island, groundwater on an island, would face the challenge of not just seawater, but the pollutants that can come from us, human beings, in our daily, weekly, monthly activities. So this has been Barbados's tackle on the issue. I don't know if anybody is here from Barbados and would like to share more on the groundwater protection zones. I find it a very useful mechanism in protecting groundwater. Protecting your recharge areas is important. Sometimes in the Caribbean, because of major development, us wanting to do residential areas, commercial areas, and so on, we may pave over everything. We pave over everything. And that causes a decrease in recharge. If it is you also destroy your watershed area might be the area that feeds directly into your recharge area. So protecting those areas is important. And Barbados has given us here in the Caribbean an example of a mechanism to essentially deal with this. I don't know if you guys have any further questions.
I have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know, I think you mentioned at some point they would recharge the aquifers with water.
Mm-hmm.
What type of
recharge?
Artificial recharge. What type of water is used to do that?
So I have seen case studies where they have used rainwater that go into a retention facility. It's something that I'm very interested in. So I started looking at it in detail. You would try to use water that is clean as possible to do artificial recharge. In some areas in the Middle East, for example, they are using what is known as recycled water. So water that comes out of their wastewater plants. They are using that because that water is essentially very clean. It may have gone through an entire UV system and all of that. And they are using that water to do their artificial recharge. Here in Trinidad, we did look at it at a point in time, but it's also a very expensive process.
Candice, there are a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you've seen it. One was about how long does it take to repair a saltwater freshwater interface? The other one is, yeah.
Okay, let me, I just pull up the questions, right? So let me go
okay, you can pull them up, right?
How long does it take to repair? Okay, so the saltwater freshwater interface essentially is the area where your freshwater that's coming down from your aquifer system meets your saltwater interface that is out at sea. So there's an area where there's an interface where they meet, and that's known as the interface itself. What I think you might be leaning towards asking is how to repair saltwater damage to your aquifer system. Essentially, if you have saltwater damage to your system, you may need to shut off that system for a period of time to allow it to cleanse and to allow fresh water to replenish the aquifer system. That could essentially take years in some instances. what some countries do once the chloride levels start to rise, and the chloride level needs to be 200, I think it's 250 milligrams per liter. That's your chloride level with World Health Organization that it needs to reach to, if I'm not mistaken. Once it gets close to that, what some countries will do is reduce production or stop production for some months. If you have in between there, if you have a really good wet season that recharge your aquifer system, then you could get that done in months. But if your salt water reaches in and it really contaminates the aquifer, it might just be years. I know of one instance in Tobago, an area named Little Englishman's Bay. I think that area has been off for the last probably about 7 years here in Trinidad and Tobago. I know in Jamaica, there would have been a few systems that would have been off at least for the last 3 years or 4 years. Around the world, this is not a phenomenon just in the Caribbean. Around the world, this is something happening. I remember in Brazil, Ignatius, I went to a presentation, one of the presentations that I went to in a coastal area in Australia. I can't remember the name of the place right now. What they did is they used artificial recharge to help stimulate the rejuvenation of the aquifer system.
Wasn't that Cape Town when they were going to the
Cape
zero?
Town?
There was
I can't remember for sure.
There was a problem, a severe drought down there.
Drought, yeah. But it probably was Cape Town then.
Yeah. And I think in Jamaica, there's a body of work done by, I don't remember.
Basil Fernandez.
Basil Fernandez about, using storage, the aquifers for storage. Particularly, we have high rainfall.
Yeah.
And a lot of that water runs off to the sea. And I think what he was proposing was that, or he's advocating that they should drill and store that water, on the ground, and they can use it for potable water.
I know that presentation all too well, and that paper all too well. That actually was in my early days in dealing with groundwater. The issues with what, or the challenges with what Basil Fernandez, who is somebody I really look up to, mind you, in this sector. One of the major issues with that would be ensuring the quality of water that you're putting into storage. If that water is contaminated in any way, you could further contaminate, or you could contaminate your aquifer system if it's not contaminated. That's one. And two, the energy costs to go with putting it back into the system, into storage there. It was phenomenal. It was a phenomenal cost, even for Trinidad, where energy cost is low. The other thing too with that, Ignatius, what he suggested there, and what he suggested there is a good suggestion, but it might be a good suggestion for an area with huge aquifers, with huge land space that they're not using. We sit on islands where land space might become limited or might be limited, especially land space on recharge areas. Some of our recharge areas are located where we have our residential areas, and putting a retention facility for recharge to happen naturally, or as naturally as possible in some of these areas too, might be challenging. Let me see if I have further questions here. I am now scrolling on the questions. I apologize, Ignatius.
Are there any similarities, Candice, to, I know with in desal systems, they use what is called an exit well to discharge brine. Is there a similarity between an injection well and those exit wells with the desal system?
I am not totally sure. To be honest, I'm not totally sure. I know that I remember looking at a presentation, I believe from Tesfa. Is Tesfa on this call?
I didn't see him, I don't know.
Okay. I know that in Antigua, they may have such, but I never looked at it in depth. I don't think, as far as I know, our desal plants in Trinidad, I don't think that we have that here. So I never really looked.
I think it's used, I think, in like the Bahamas,
Okay.
where they use those, rather than discharging out into the open waters. And I think Barbados had a situation where they had to, I think it was to do with a wastewater situation they had. So, yeah, I think somebody's saying that discharge of brine, that is what is done in the Cayman Islands.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you may, you go ahead, Mr. Gandry.
Oh, hi. In
Thank you.
Trinidad. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. Good afternoon. Thank you, Candice and St. Ignatius for good presentation, and good to see everybody from all over the Caribbean here. Cayman, the water story is a little bit different because there's no confined aquifers. We have a shortage on fresh water, fresh natural groundwater, and no rivers. So we're forced to go to desalination. Our geology for the desalination plants, it is better actually to obtain your feed water for those plants from feed water wells rather than from the sea, because your pre-treatment is a lot easier, or basically absent. And also, after the fresh water is made by the desalination plant, you're left with the brine, which is basically the salt in the water that is left. And in our case, our geology facilitates that. We put it back in the ground. But it goes at a deeper depth than where we extract the feed water for these plants. So in that sense, I think in the way you explained that earlier, Candice, that is an example of an injection well.
Okay.
Candice, hello?
Hi.
Yeah, Candice, with regards to Trinidad and that brine, in you would know we have two major desal plants.
Yeah,
Desal
Point
cuts, which
Lisas
is
and
in
Point Fortin.
Couva and Seven Seas in
Point Fortin.
Point Fortin. They both discharge back into the sea, right?
Yeah.
So it's not used for any type of recharge.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you did mention the chloride standard of 250. Now that is the upper acceptable limit, obviously based on World Health Organization standards. But the corresponding part of that, which is the conductivity levels.
Yeah.
When we see conductivity approaching 1,000, that is when we start to talk to operations and tell them they need to stop, or they need to reduce the extraction. Anytime it gets like about 14 to 1,500, it is at that point we stop them.
Yeah.
All right. So that's what we do here. All right.
Yeah.
But good presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
All right.
So yeah, Mr. Jones is right. I did mention the chloride levels, but the conductivity level is another parameter that you could look at to determine your saltwater or the potential for seawater contamination. Right. So I have another question here. Could you talk a little bit about wellhead in terms of flooding and wellhead protection? Well, you must protect your wellhead from flooding and protection. In Trinidad here, we try to site our wells away from the floodplain, 1. 2, there is a casing. Okay, I don't know what just happened there. Okay. You all hearing me still?
Yes, yes, we're hearing you. Sorry, my bad.
Oh,
I took off your share. Sorry.
no problem. Yes, so there is a casing that you will put over your production well to protect it. In case a facility is flooded, what we try to do is ensure that it's clean immediately after. Any debris, any particles that might remain, we try to clean it. Yeah, but generally you try your best not to site production wells in floodplains. So do I have any further questions?
Any further questions, participants? We certainly like to have your questions or comments. And we really like to thank all of you for having joined us this afternoon. I think this was a very good presentation by Candice. We'd like to thank her immensely. And let me remind all of you who are with us this afternoon that we are open to you as well. If you, I believe we have a lot of resource capabilities in our various utilities around the region, and certainly feel free if you would like to make such a presentation on an area of your choice. You could just shoot me an email and we're going to line you up for some presentation in the near future. So feel free to do that. But I think that was another very good one in the series. That's number 16 today on groundwater. And I think it brought out some, gave us some good insights into what's taking place in a few islands in the Caribbean. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you next week. And I think, Candice, you have an opportunity to pull a plug for the CWWA. Please go ahead.
Hi, so the CWWA is hosting a conference a little later on in October. Feel free to check our website for more information. There will be about 4 presentations on groundwater and varying aspects of groundwater during that week. There will be presentations on topics ranging from water treatment, water resources, wastewater management. I looked at a really good abstract earlier on today on COVID-19 and wastewater. And these presentations will be brought to you by fellow folks from around the Caribbean. So definitely check that out. I hope that you guys will be interested in that. If you are interested, feel free to contact me or to contact our website. Many of you may be in utilities as well that may be logging in. So you could check your general manager or your director and see if your utility is signed in or signing in of you folks, and get on there for the week. Increase your capacity on what you know, what you have learned, and definitely continue to grow in this very dynamic water sector. Ignatius, I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'd like to thank everyone that logged in here this afternoon for this opportunity for us to continue learning and growing in our sector.
Thank you very much, Candice. And I'd like, on behalf of CAWASA, to thank you and all the participants, and we look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Ignatius Jean, signing off from CAWASA. Cheers. Have a good evening.